The hangar bay was never a quiet place during the day. Big cargo ships came and went. Workers shouted over the noise of engines, and the smell of fuel and metal filled every corner. But at night, when most of the crew had gone to sleep, the lower hangar became something else entirely. The lights dimmed to a soft, orange glow. The machines rested. The only sounds were the slow hum of the station's ventilation system and the distant creaking of the docking clamps as they held the ships in place. Gary Cole liked the night shift. He had worked as a maintenance mechanic on docking station Rhea 7 for almost 4 years, and in all that time, he had learned that the best way to find a problem before it became a disaster was to walk the hangar slowly, listen carefully, and pay attention to things that did not seem right. Most nights, it was just a loose bolt or a leaking fuel line. Nothing dramatic, just quiet, honest work. He was on his third round of the lower bay when he heard it. It was not a loud sound. If the ventilation system had been running at full speed, he probably would have missed it completely. But in that particular moment, the fans had cycled down to their lowest setting, and the hangar was almost perfectly still. And in that stillness, Gary heard something that did not belong there. A small, trembling sound, like an animal trying very hard not to cry. He stopped walking. He stood still for a moment and listened. The sound came again, soft and broken, from somewhere behind the tall stack of fuel canisters near the east wall. Gary had loaded those canisters himself 2 days ago. He knew there was a narrow gap between the back of the stack and the wall, just enough space for a person to squeeze into if they really wanted to. He walked toward the canisters slowly, not wanting to make too much noise with his boots on the metal floor. When he reached the edge of the stack, he crouched down and looked into the gap. At first, he could not make out what he was seeing. The light back there was very poor, just a thin stripe of orange glow from the overhead lamp above. But then his eyes adjusted and he saw it clearly. A child, small, curled tightly into itself, wings pressed flat against its back, tail wrapped around its own body like it was trying to hold itself together. The scales were a pale silver color, dull and cold-looking, not the bright shine that healthy Veilithi scales were supposed to have. The child was shaking, not a little, a lot. Every few seconds, a hard shiver ran through its small body from nose to tail tip. Gary had seen Veilithi adults a handful of times at the station. They were large, proud creatures, tall and broad-shouldered, with long necks and deep amber eyes that always seemed to be measuring everything around them. Meeting a Veilithi adult for the first time was not a comfortable experience for most humans. They moved with a kind of quiet confidence that made you feel like you were standing in the wrong place. But this was not an adult. This was a child, and it was clearly very frightened and very cold. Gary did not stand up and call for help right away. He had learned over the years that startling a frightened creature, human or otherwise, never helped anything. So he stayed crouched at the edge of the stack and spoke in a low, calm voice. "Hey," he said, "I see you back there. I am not going to hurt you." The child flinched. Its eyes opened and they were a pale gold color, not yet the deep amber of an adult. Those eyes looked at Gary with pure fear. "It is okay," Gary said again. "My name is Gary. I work here. I am just a mechanic." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the child shifted, just a little. Its small head lifted slightly, and it looked at Gary with an expression that was hard to read, but felt something like desperate hope. Then it spoke. The voice was tiny and unsteady, and the galactic standard words came out broken and slow, like the child had learned them recently and was not yet comfortable with them. "Mama," it said. "Mama is dying." Gary felt something cold move through his chest. Not fear, exactly. Something heavier than that. "Your mama is here on the station?" he asked carefully. The child gave a small, jerky nod. Another shiver ran through its body. "She is hurt," the child said. The ship fell. Mama told me to go, to find someone, to ask." The pale gold eyes filled with something that looked very much like tears, though Gary had never known that Veilithi could cry. "Please help," the child said in a voice so small it was almost nothing. "Please." Gary was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. That was how long it took him to make his decision. He reached slowly into the gap between the canisters, not grabbing, just offering his hand, palm up, the way you would offer something to an animal you did not want to frighten further. The child looked at his hand for a long moment. Then, with another hard shiver, it reached out and placed one small, clawed hand into his. Gary stood up carefully, making sure not to move too fast. With his free hand, he pulled out his comm unit and called Laura Simmons, the station's night medic. "Laura," he said when she answered, "I need you in the lower hangar. Bring your kit, bring everything." He looked down at the small dragon child standing beside him, still shaking, still holding his hand with a grip that was surprisingly strong for something so small. "What happened?" Laura asked through the comm. "I will explain when you get here," Gary said. "Just come fast." Laura Simmons arrived in the lower hangar within 4 minutes. She was a short woman with quick eyes and steady hands, the kind of person who did not ask too many questions before getting to work. She had been the night medic on Rhea 7 for 2 years, and in that time she had treated burns, broken bones, pressure sickness, and once a very complicated situation involving a Torathi crew member and a faulty oxygen regulator. She thought she had seen most things. She had not seen this. She stopped when she reached Gary and looked down at the small Veilithi child standing beside him, one tiny clawed hand still wrapped around 2 of Gary's fingers. The child looked up at Laura with those pale gold eyes, and Laura looked back. Then she knelt down to the child's level just as Gary had done and spoke in a soft voice. "Hello," she said. "My name is Laura. I am a medic. That means I help people who are hurt. Can you tell me your name?" The child hesitated. Then, very quietly, it said, "Sarah." "Sarah," Laura repeated, and she smiled. "That is a good name. Sarah, can you take us to your mama?" Sarah looked up at Gary first, as if checking whether she could trust this new person. Gary gave a small nod. Sarah turned back to Laura and nodded once. She led them through the lower hangar, past rows of parked cargo loaders and stacked equipment crates, toward the far end of the docking ring where the older, less used berths were located. These berths were mostly empty at night. The lights down there were on their lowest setting, and the floor was dusty with disuse. Gary had not been to this section in over a week. They found the ship tucked into berth 41, and Gary understood immediately why no one had noticed it before. It had come in at an angle, clearly not under full control, and had settled hard against the docking wall on its left side. A collapsed loading ramp had folded down on top of part of the hull, hiding the ship's shape from casual view. If you were not looking for it, you would walk right past it. Gary looked at the damage and felt his stomach tighten. Whatever had happened to this ship, it had not been a gentle landing. Sarah let go of Gary's hand and moved quickly to a side hatch near the rear of the ship. The hatch was partially open, bent slightly out of shape by the impact. She squeezed through it without hesitating, clearly having already used this entrance before. Gary and Laura exchanged a quick look, then followed. Inside, the ship was dark and tilted. The floor was not level, and Gary had to steady himself with one hand on the wall as he moved forward. Loose items had slid to the lower side of the cabin. A travel bag, some kind of sealed food container, a small woven blanket that had ended up crumpled in the corner. The air smelled like hot metal and something else, something Gary could not name but that made him feel uneasy. Sarah had already gone ahead. They followed her voice to the main cabin, and that was where they found Vireth. She was lying on her side against the lower wall of the cabin, which had become the floor after the ship tilted. She was large, as adult Veilithi always were, with deep charcoal-colored scales and long, folded wings that were pressed awkwardly beneath her. Her breathing was slow and uneven, each breath coming with a visible effort. There was a dark stain spreading across the scales below her left wing, and her eyes, when they opened at the sound of footsteps, were unfocused and slow. She looked at Gary and Laura, and for a moment something moved in those deep amber eyes. Not anger, not pride, something that looked very much like fear, though Gary suspected that Virith was not a creature who showed fear easily or often. She said something in Velithi. Her voice was low and rough. Sarah answered quickly in the same language, and then added in Galactic Standard for Gary and Laura's benefit, "I told her you are helping. I told her you are good." Laura was already moving. She set her kit down, opened it, and began working with the calm efficiency of someone who had trained for exactly this kind of moment. She spoke quietly as she worked, not to anyone in particular, just narrating what she was doing in a low voice, the way she always did when she needed to think clearly. Gary looked around the cabin and made a fast decision about what needed to happen. The light was too poor. He went back through the hatch, jogged to the nearest equipment locker along the hangar wall, and pulled out 2 portable work lamps. He brought them back, set them up inside the cabin, and the space filled with clean, white light. Laura glanced up and gave him a small nod of thanks without slowing down. Then Gary looked at the collapsed ramp pressing against the hull outside. It was not causing immediate danger, but it was blocking the hatch at an awkward angle, and if Laura needed to move Virith, it was going to be a problem. He went back out and spent the next several minutes working the ramp mechanism by hand, pushing, levering it carefully until it lifted just enough to give a clear path. When he came back inside, Sarah was sitting close to her mother's head, very still, watching Laura work. Virith's breathing had not improved, but it had not gotten worse either. Laura looked up at Gary with an expression that was honest without being hopeless. "She has internal bleeding below the wing joint," Laura said quietly. "I can slow it down with what I have here, but she needs more than I can do alone in a crashed ship." "Tell me what you need," Gary said. Laura told him. It was a long list. Gary pulled out his comm unit and started making calls. The first supply Gary called for arrived within 10 minutes. A young crew member named Pete Walsh came down from the medical storage room carrying 2 bags of equipment, his eyes going wide when he saw the crashed ship, and then wider still when he stepped inside and saw Virith. He froze for just a moment in the doorway, the bags hanging from his hands, staring at the large Velithi female lying against the tilted wall. Gary looked at him from across the cabin. "Pete," he said simply. Pete blinked, nodded once, and handed the bags to Laura without another word. That was enough. He stayed and helped. A second crew member arrived shortly after, a woman named Dana Ford who worked in the station's supply depot and had heard Gary's call on the open channel. She brought extra bandaging material and a portable pressure unit that Laura had asked for specifically. Dana was not a medic, but she followed Laura's instructions carefully and did not flinch at anything she saw. The work was slow and difficult. The cabin was tilted and cramped, and moving around Virith without disturbing her injuries required constant care. Laura worked steadily, her hands never rushing even when Gary could see the tension in her face. She had managed to slow the bleeding, but Virith was still weak, still breathing in that heavy, labored way that made the air in the cabin feel thick. Sarah stayed close to her mother the entire time. She did not cry. She did not make noise. She just sat near Virith's head with her small wings folded tight against her back and watched everything with those pale gold eyes. Every so often, Virith would open her eyes and look at her daughter, and Sarah would say something soft in Velithi, and Virith would close her eyes again. Gary noticed that each time this happened, Virith seemed to breathe a little easier for a short while. He did not understand the words, but he understood what they were doing. He was outside clearing more space around the hatch when he heard boots on the hangar floor coming from the direction of the main corridor. More than one pair, moving fast and with purpose. Carl Briggs appeared at the entrance to berth 41 with 2 station security officers behind him. Carl was the station administrator, a man in his late 50s with thin hair and the permanent expression of someone who had just been handed a problem he did not want. He was wearing his official jacket, which meant someone had thought this was worth waking him up for. He looked at the crashed ship, then at Gary, and his expression shifted from annoyed to something more complicated. "Cole," he said, "what exactly is going on here?" Gary straightened up and kept his voice level. "A ship came in hard and crashed in berth 41. There is a seriously injured adult Velithi inside and a child. Laura Simmons is providing medical assistance right now." Carl looked at the ship again. Then he looked at the berth number on the wall. Then he looked back at Gary. "This ship has no docking clearance," Carl said. "It is not registered in any of today's arrival logs. It did not contact the station before entry. That is 3 separate protocol violations." "Yes," Gary said, "it is." "Then you understand that we cannot simply treat this as a normal situation. If we provide unauthorized assistance to an unregistered Velithi vessel, we create a formal diplomatic record. And right now, with the trade delegation on this station, a formal diplomatic record involving the Velithi could—" "Carl," Gary said. Carl stopped. Gary kept his voice calm and even. Not angry, just clear. "There is a mother in that ship who is bleeding internally. Her daughter is sitting next to her and has been alone and frightened for however long it took her to find someone to ask for help. Laura is in there right now, doing her best with what she has. I understand what you are telling me about protocols, I do, but I am asking you to look at what is actually happening here and tell me that a trade agreement is more important than what I just described." Carl was quiet for a moment. The 2 security officers behind him did not move or speak. "I am not saying she should not receive care," Carl said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier firmness. "I am saying there is a process. There are forms. There are notifications that need to go to—" "Then file the forms," Gary said. "Do the notifications. Do everything you need to do. But do it while Laura is still working, not instead of it." Carl looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the hatch of the ship. Through it, faintly, came the sound of Laura's quiet voice giving Dana an instruction, and then the small, soft sound of Sarah saying something to her mother in Velithi. Something shifted in Carl's expression. It was not a dramatic change. It was small and quick, and if Gary had not been watching carefully, he might have missed it entirely. But it was there. Carl turned to one of the security officers. "Go back to the main office and start the unauthorized docking paperwork," he said. "Standard form, Incident Category 3. I will sign it in the morning." The officer nodded and left. Carl looked at Gary one more time. He did not say anything else. He just turned and walked back toward the main corridor, his hands behind his back, moving slowly like a man thinking something through. Gary watched him go. Then he turned back to the ship. Pete was leaning out of the hatch. "Laura says she could use another set of hands in here," he said. Gary nodded and went back inside. Sarah looked up when he entered. She had not moved from her mother's side, but when Gary came back in, she shifted just slightly in his direction, the way a small creature moves towards something that feels safe. Gary settled down onto the floor nearby, close enough to be there if she needed him. He did not say anything. He did not need to. The next 2 hours were the longest Gary had spent in a long time. Laura worked without stopping. She did not complain about the cramped space or the tilted floor or the poor angle she had to maintain just to keep pressure on the right areas. She just worked, quietly and carefully, the way she always did. Pete and Dana stayed close, handing her what she needed before she even finished asking for it. They had fallen into a rhythm, the 3 of them, moving around each other in the small cabin without getting in each other's way. Gary stayed near the hatch. He was not a medic, and he knew better than to crowd Laura's space. But he was useful in other ways. When Laura needed something from outside, he got it. When the portable lamps needed repositioning, he moved them. When a section of loose ceiling paneling above the cabin began creaking from the ship's uneven weight, Gary wedged a support rod against it before it could become a problem. He kept his hands busy and his eyes open and let Laura do what she was trained to do. Sarah had not moved from her mother's side. She sat with her knees pulled up and her wings folded against her back, watching Vireth's face with an expression of careful, quiet hope. Every few minutes she would lean close and say something soft in Velithi, just a few words spoken right near her mother's ear. Gary did not know what she was saying. He did not ask. It was not his to know. Around the 2nd hour, something changed. Vireth's breathing, which had been shallow and uneven since they arrived, began to slow into something steadier. Not strong, not normal, but steadier. Laura noticed it first. She sat back slightly on her heels and checked her readings, then checked them again. Then she let out a long, slow breath through her nose, the kind of breath that means a weight has shifted just a little. "The bleeding has stopped," she said. Her voice was quiet but clear. "She is not out of danger. She needs proper medical equipment and rest and monitoring, but the immediate crisis is past." Pete closed his eyes for just a second. Dana pressed her hand flat against the wall and leaned on it. Gary looked at Sarah. Sarah had heard Laura's words. She understood enough galactic standard for that. She looked at Laura with those pale gold eyes, and her small mouth opened slightly, and for the first time since Gary had found her behind the fuel canisters, the tight, careful expression on her face came apart. Not into crying, into something quieter than that. Relief, moving through a small body that had been holding itself rigid for a very long time. She turned to her mother and pressed her forehead very gently against Vireth's cheek and stayed there. Vireth's eyes opened. They were still slow and unfocused, but they were open, and they found Sarah immediately, the way a mother's eyes always find their child first, no matter what else is happening around them. Vireth made a low sound, deep and soft, something that needed no translation at all. Then slowly those amber eyes moved. They traveled around the cabin, taking in Laura and her equipment, taking in Pete and Dana, and finally coming to rest on Gary, who was sitting near the hatch with his back against the wall and his work gloves still on his hands. Vireth looked at him for a long moment. Then she spoke. Her voice was rough and very tired, but the words came out in galactic standard, slow and deliberate, like she was choosing each one with care. "Why?" she said. "Why did you help me?" It was not asked with suspicion, it was asked with genuine confusion, the kind that comes from a person who has lived long enough to stop expecting certain things from the world. Gary thought about it. He did not answer right away because he wanted to give her a real answer, not just the first words that came to his mouth. "Your daughter asked me to," he said finally. That was enough. Vireth was quiet for a moment. Her eyes stayed on him. "In my culture," she said slowly, "we do not ask strangers for help. It is considered a weakness. Sarah knows this. I taught her this." She paused. Another slow breath. "She asked you anyway." "She did," Gary said. "She was more afraid of losing me than she was of the rules," Vireth said, and something in her voice when she said it was not disapproval. It was something that sounded very much like wonder. Gary did not say anything to that. He just nodded once. Vireth looked at him for another long moment. Then she lifted her right hand from the floor. It was a slow movement, clearly painful, but deliberate. She reached it toward Gary, the large, scaled palm facing upward, and held it there. Gary looked at the hand. He was not sure what the gesture meant, but he understood the intention behind it clearly enough. He reached over and placed his own hand over hers. Vireth's fingers, each one longer than Gary's whole hand, closed around his very gently. Laura watched this from across the cabin. She did not say anything. Neither did Pete or Dana. Sarah lifted her head from her mother's cheek and looked at Gary with those pale gold eyes. And then, slowly, the corners of her small mouth turned upward. It was the first time Gary had seen her smile. It was a small thing, uncertain and tired, the smile of a child who has been frightened for a very long time and has only just begun to believe that things might be all right. But it was real, and it was there, and it was directed at him. Gary smiled back. Outside in the hangar, the ventilation fans cycled up to their daytime speed. Somewhere above them, the station was beginning its morning routine, lights brightening, crew members starting their shifts, the ordinary noise of a working day beginning to fill the corridors. Inside berth 41, nobody moved for a little while longer. Nobody needed to. The days that followed were quieter than anyone expected. Vireth was moved to the station's medical bay on the morning after the incident, once Laura was satisfied that she was stable enough to be transported safely. It took some careful coordination to move a full-grown Veilithi through the station corridors without causing a scene, but Gary and Pete managed it with a small anti-gravity stretcher and a lot of patience. Most of the crew members they passed in the corridors stopped and stared. A few stepped back, but nobody caused trouble, and nobody said anything unkind, at least not out loud. Carl Briggs had filed his paperwork. Category 3 incident, unauthorized docking, no further action recommended. He had signed it himself and sent it to the Regional Transit Authority without any additional commentary. Gary found out about this from Pete, who had seen the filing on the station's internal system. Gary did not make anything of it. He just noted it quietly and moved on. Vireth spent 3 days in the medical bay. Laura visited twice a day, every day, checking her progress with the same calm efficiency she brought to everything. Vireth did not speak much during those first 2 days. She was tired and healing, and Veilithi, Laura learned, needed a great deal of stillness to recover properly. But she watched everything with those deep amber eyes, missing nothing, taking in every detail of how the station operated and how its people moved and spoke around her. Sarah, on the other hand, was not still at all. On the first morning after her mother was settled in the medical bay, Sarah appeared in the lower hangar at the start of Gary's shift. She was carrying something wrapped in a piece of dark cloth, held carefully in both hands. Gary was under a cargo loader doing a routine check on the undercarriage when he heard the small tap of clawed feet on the metal floor and looked out to find her standing a few feet away, watching him with her head tilted to one side. He slid out from under the loader and sat up. Sarah held out the wrapped cloth. Gary took it and opened it carefully. Inside was a small, flat piece of bread, dense and dark, with a faint smell that was unfamiliar but not unpleasant. He looked at her. "Veilithi travel bread," Sarah said seriously. "Mama always brings it. She says it gives strength for long journeys." She paused. "I want you to have it." Gary looked at the bread in his hands and then back at the small dragon child standing in front of him, with her wings folded neatly and her pale gold eyes watching him with great seriousness. "Thank you, Sarah," he said. "I will eat it at lunch." Sarah nodded, satisfied, and then sat down cross-legged on the hangar floor nearby and watched him go back to work. She did not talk much. She seemed content just to be there, in the same space, the way young creatures sometimes are when they feel safe somewhere and do not want to leave it. She came back the next morning with another piece of bread, and the morning after that. On the third day, something happened that Gary did not expect. He was at the main hangar entrance talking with Dana about a supply delivery when a station comm officer came to find him. The officer told him with a slightly bewildered expression that a formal message had arrived from the Veilithi Outer Council. It had been addressed not to the station administrator, not to the transit authority, but to the station in general, with Gary Cole's name mentioned specifically in the opening line. Gary read the message in the break room with Laura sitting across from him drinking her morning coffee. The message was formal and carefully worded, the kind of language that governments use when they want to say something meaningful without using too many simple words. But the meaning was clear enough. The Veilithi Outer Council had been informed of the events at docking station Rhea 7. They acknowledged that one of their citizens had landed without clearance and that this was a violation of transit agreements. They took full responsibility for that. But they also wished to formally acknowledge that the response of the station's personnel had been noted and that acts of care shown to Veilithi citizens in distress would not be forgotten. That was all it said. No dramatic promises, no grand declarations, just a quiet, formal acknowledgement from a proud people who did not find it easy to say thank you. Gary folded the message and put it in his jacket pocket. Laura looked at him over her coffee. "How does it feel," she said, "to accidentally start an interspecies diplomatic moment while doing a routine maintenance round?" "About the same as usual," Gary said. Laura laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that fills a small room. Later that day, Carl Briggs passed Gary in the main corridor. He did not stop walking, and he did not make a speech, but he gave Gary a single nod as he passed, the kind of nod that meant something without needing any words attached to it. Gary nodded back. That evening, Vireth was well enough to sit up and have a real conversation. Laura was there, and Gary came after his shift ended, still in his work clothes with grease on his hands that he had not quite managed to wash off completely. He sat in the chair beside Vireth's bed and they talked for a long time, slowly and carefully, pausing often to find the right words in a shared language that was not fully comfortable for either of them. But the conversation was real. That was what mattered. Vireth told him a little about where she had been going when the ship failed. Gary told her a little about how he had ended up working on a station at the edge of nowhere. Sarah sat between them on the floor and listened to everything with her chin resting on her hands. On the morning of the fourth day, Vireth's ship had been partially repaired by the station's technical crew, enough to make the remainder of her journey safely. Gary and Laura came to the hangar to see them off. Pete and Dana were there too, standing a little to one side, not making a production of it, but wanting to be there anyway. Vireth stopped in front of Gary before boarding. She looked at him for a moment with those deep, amber eyes that missed nothing. "You gave my daughter her mother back," she said. "There are no sufficient words for that in any language I know." Gary looked at her steadily. "You do not need to find them," he said. Vireth held his gaze a moment longer. Then she turned and walked up the boarding ramp with the quiet, measured dignity of someone who had been through something hard and come out the other side of it still standing. Sarah was last. She stopped in front of Gary and looked up at him, and then she did something that made Laura reach quietly for her comm unit so she could look something up without anyone noticing. Sarah pressed her small forehead against the back of Gary's hand. She held it there for 3 seconds. Then she stepped back, looked up at him one last time with those pale gold eyes, and followed her mother up the ramp. The ship lifted smoothly and moved out through the hangar opening into open space, growing smaller until it was just a point of light among many others. Gary stood at the hangar entrance and watched it go. Laura appeared beside him a moment later, her eyes on her comm unit screen. "I looked it up," she said quietly. "What does it mean?" Gary said. Laura was quiet for a second. Then she said, "It means you are family now." Gary did not say anything for a while. He just stood there in the wide hangar entrance with the cold light of open space coming in and the familiar smell of fuel and metal all around him,